we can evolve ourselves to be able to, in getting real, I call it holding differences. And it's a real discipline to be able to fully listen to somebody whose views you kind of violently disagree with, to hold more complexity, basically. And again, the best place to learn that is in an interpersonal, really face-to-face kind of situation. Oh, I see this as that our whole authentic relating movement is a place to learn to be more fully what humans can be and evolve ourselves consciously. So change and conflict are the two biggest challenges of our time, is the way I like to think of it. And these practices really help you uh, step forward and become one of those people, one of the wiser people, rather than just smart.
Well, welcome, Susan, and super happy to have you here. We have never met in real life, but I've seen you out there in the relatosphere or whatever we call it. Um, and one thing that I am really excited about with having you here is that I started doing these relating things like 10, 15 years ago, depending on how we count. And then for me, it was really cool to find a book that was from 2001, I think,
Yeah.
that basically sort of is the book on this stuff. And I really appreciated, yeah, starting reading that. I wanted to finish it before this call, but I had a child in the meantime, so that took precedence. But I've
Mhm.
appreciated reading Getting Real so far. And what stands out for me is this idea of letting go of control and thus being able to participate more in life. So I imagine that will come up in our conversation quite a bit.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I'm very curious to hear how you came into this world of relating practice and what your journey has been like. So I imagine it's been quite a ride.
Yeah, I think I'll start with when I got my PhD. I got my PhD in 1967, and the practices that were available then were basically tea groups. That was already happening. Uh, but let me also say that my own journey was influenced by the fact that when I came of age, and this was in the 60s, 1967 was considered the summer of love. Okay, so psychedelics and the movement toward love and peace, and what if we had a war and nobody came? Those kind of phrases were important in the culture. There was the beginning of the counterculture. So, I'm very much a product of the counterculture, although I grew up in a family that was pretty much counterculture, which means that we always questioned the system where materialism and greed trump human values like love and compassion and caring and cooperation. So the NTL movement was kind of, we used to call it the love trust movement. It was an attempt. I mean, that whole movement. We did a lot of civil rights protesting, a lot of anti-war protesting because the Vietnam War was going on then. So it came from a social conscience. I come from a background and a value on culture change, and so just basically I saw around me people who were developing themselves, and my parents were like this too, um, developing themselves in ways that stood outside the culture and was critical of the dominant paradigm, which didn't question authority. Was very obedient to authority. The 50s was a very obedient to authority culture. Everybody was conformist, trying to keep up with each other in terms of status seeking and that sort of thing. You may say nothing's changed. And in a way, unfortunately, I think our whole movement, there's been backs and forths, and there's been an evolution of consciousness and so forth. Uh, but, we're back in the same racism, sexism, greed, materialism, unsustainable practices, corporate practices that are basically destroying our environment. So those things are more in my foreground um, than relating per se. My goal is developing wiser humans. And I think all these relational arts are part of that. So, I come from let's make human flourishing and human development a better game than war. I wrote one book called Beyond the Power Struggle, and I talked about a better game than war, how if we uh, could put more value on the joy of really knowing one another and stretching our comfort zone in relational risk taking rather than doing stupid things that harm the environment and so forth. And just the accumulation of power. Okay, so that's all sort of the values underlying the, I think the NTL movement. National Training Laboratories is what NTL stands for. And right after I got my PhD in clinical psychology at UMass, I started teaching there. I taught in the graduate school, but I was also getting training, postdoctoral training from this NTL Institute, where they not only taught T groups, but they also taught organization development, group process. So, but let me just say the T group is the main precursor to all the other stuff that we're involved in nowadays. And and in a way, Carl Rogers was one of the very early pioneers, and he wasn't even really part of the T group movement. But when I was in college, even before grad school, I used to hear that he would, this was at University of Chicago, he would have classes where people would just sit in a room together and he would not say much. He would just say, here we are all together. What are we going to do with this time we have together? And it was a little experimental. And when I heard about it, I thought, wow, that's pretty radical. But then I also learned that in Europe, there was already this group called Tavistock. And maybe some of our people, even today, have heard of Tavistock. But that's also a group um, format where the leader doesn't say much. You just kind of see what happens. And the leader will usually make interpretations about what's going on in the group, like maybe seems like Joe is becoming the default leader here, or it seems like Susie is afraid to speak up. They would make interpretations like that, and that would cause a lot of anxiety in the group. And that was Tavistock. And the Carl Rogers model was more heart-centered, and he would be more of a like normal human member of the group, and he might say things about his own feelings and his own responses to people, feedback, sharing impact, that sort of thing. So mostly this movement was led by professors. And I was a professor, and almost all my colleagues at NTL were professors. The economy was such in those days that, well, first of all, the professors had summers off, most college professors. So we did a lot of our work during the summers, during these 1 and 2 week residential tea groups. at a place called, well, a town called Bethel, Maine. It was a boys' school that was available during the summer. And so we'd take over the boys' school. And most of our participants were business leaders, managers, clergy, teachers, but a lot of them were sent by their company and paid for by their company. So, first of all, the economy was so much different in the 60s. I'm going to say it was a lot better. You know, people, families could live on one parent's income, for example. Uh, I would go on job interviews where they would fly me first class, and I had an expense account for my job interviews for college teaching jobs. I just want to give you a flavor that I think the economy, definitely uh, created, the kind of good economy created the opportunity for people to take 1 and 2 weeks off from their jobs to sit in a room with strangers and talk about their feelings. And so that was the kind of picture. And us facilitators, we were trained very well by the NTL Institute in terms of things like how to facilitate unstructured groups. So these were unstructured. It wasn't like authentic relating games or circling and later on, we did a lot of those games too. I mean, there's many books from the 60s and 70s full of uh, games. There was this huge facilitator's handbook with all these different exercises. And I contributed to that. And a lot of us contributed to that. So it's almost like in the late 90s and early 2000s when the authentic relating movement, that was called that, was developing. It was kind of like history repeating itself for me.
Uh-huh.
And I never left that world though. I kept that alive in my work, for like 60 years now. So early groups were the long form groups. We hardly ever did like a 2 hour group or something like I do now. And you can't, it became much harder to sell a whole week program or a 2 week program, as the economy uh, changed, uh, especially after Reagan. So, my journey, let's see, like I was already really oriented toward risk taking and honest communication and just caring. I mean, I was already that kind of a individual. So I just naturally, that was going to be my life's work. Of course, I was trained as a clinical psychologist too, so I always had a private practice. And I always did corporate training and consulting, but it was mainly team building. And team building is kind of like family therapy in a group. It's kind of like just getting everybody to say what they really feel, learning how to clear the air, learning how to give and receive feedback. So those were all the early skills that we taught, and we tried to bring them into the mainstream. That it wasn't like a little subculture like it is now so much, although the facilitators were like a subculture, but our mission was the world, and especially corporate America and teachers. So then T groups kind of evolved into encounter groups, which were much more focused on individuals. A lot of times, so it was a little bit like circling an encounter group. You would, for a while, one individual would somehow call attention to themselves, and then the group would respond. Sometimes they would call attention to themselves in ways that showed that they were pretty unconscious of how they were coming across. And so we would all try to help them see themselves as others see you. And it could be quite hurtful to the person in the hot seat kind of thing. We didn't, Fritz Perls called his groups the hot seat. There was also Gestalt therapy going on then, and I was trained as a Gestalt therapist after that, and now that's been a big influence on me. But Fritz Perls's groups, which of course I attended many, were more one person sits on the hot seat, Fritz works with them, and then other people chime in. What came up for me as and it was fairly disciplined there. What came up for me in witnessing your work, and that's a lot of what I take. I didn't go for the feedback that used to be called the feedback that was interpretive and you messages and that sort of thing. I was always very strongly on the whole idea of stay on your own side of the net. You can only be honest about yourself, and these are some of my trademark phrases now that are in the book Getting Real. That means you speak about your own experience and you're responsible for your own experience. But you refrain from telling other people how they feel, that sort of thing. So all of those values were part of that early 1960s, 1970s tea groups, encounter groups. But I was starting to say the encounter groups, most of the leaders were pretty responsible. They would prevent one person from being piled on and that sort of thing. But I know that's still a dynamic that we have to be careful of it as facilitators, is helping people know when they've had enough, checking with the group, are we done here? Are we ready to move on? And that sort of thing. Because in the early days, I think we didn't realize how fragile a lot of people are. It was not trauma informed in those days. I've done a lot of work on traumas and triggers. I've written 4 books after the book Getting Real. And the thing that I'm most passionate about is people understanding and learning how to work with their own trigger reactions, like the fight, flight, freeze that happens when you don't feel safe. So that was happening all over the place in the early groups. But we weren't very sophisticated in how to deal with that, other than kind of getting the group to pause and making sure the person wasn't overwhelmed. But we didn't have the concept of triggers. I didn't really get the concept of triggering until I was married to a man who was highly triggerable, and I was already 40 years old. And then I began to give a lot of, so 40 years old, that would have been around 1980, 82. Around 1980 is when I started teaching and writing about triggers. And now, I used to call it what to do when your buttons get pushed and that sort of thing. So I gave a lot of workshops for corporations and public groups, mostly corporations, on what to do when your buttons get pushed. So let's see, we're going to counter groups, and I mentioned Gestalt groups, and those were all things that I was very involved in all of that. I was teaching that kind of stuff. I taught Gestalt therapy at the graduate school level. I taught psychosynthesis, which is more of a spiritually oriented practice, where you notice that I have a body, but I am not my body. I have a mind, but I am not my mind. So that's called disidentification. And that's now re-emerging as non-duality and certain other spiritual practices. So it's I've seen cycles here, but each cycle adds a lot. So my own movement after teaching at UMass. So I taught at UMass until 1977. So that was 10 years from 67 to 77. is where we are now. And then I moved to California. That was all in Massachusetts. Uh, and California, I taught at the what was called then the Humanistic Psychology Institute. And my colleagues were people like Rollo May, Jim Bugenthal. I mean, these were leaders, giants in the field of humanistic psychology. Um, Sam Keen, yeah, some like famous people, but they weren't really into the group movement so much. But humanistic psychology was a big force in the culture, and we had a lot of conferences, and we would learn from each other. And in those days, we really did want to learn from each other, the different schools, and I suppose that's still that way. Um, the spiritual schools, not so much, but that's a whole other thing because there were always, uh, different spiritual schools. I guess I shouldn't go into that, but they had conferences where the aim was let's learn from each other, but there would just be, I want to sell my angle on reality, and this other person wants to sell theirs. And there wasn't a spirit of collaboration. But in the humanistic psychology conferences, there really were. I went to all those different things. It used to be called transpersonal psychology. And and there were other spiritual conferences that brought the Sufis together with the Buddhists and the Hindus, and that's what I mean by the spiritual conferences.
Mm.
So all the while, this is a very exciting world because the world was in such, it seemed to me, such turmoil, especially during the 60s and 70s, because the war was still going on. I mean, we were all in tremendous pain. I was in tremendous, no, personal pain, uh, because of the war and also because of the civil rights protests that were riots in the streets. And I would watch those on television and I would cry. So, I mean, it seems like my whole motivation was to make the world a better place, and to make humans more aware of, hey, what we're doing is not working. So my primary identity, I guess, is a consultant and teacher where I try to help people step above the problem and look together at, and even when I work with couples, let's look together at what's going on with this couple. And oh my gosh, they've had so many unrepaired ruptures. So that's how they got to this place. They didn't know how to repair. So I'm usually trying to help people see themselves and see if their behavior is getting uh, results that are beneficial to the whole. Um, so you see, I have a mission here. I guess my own personal growth was also part of my mission, but I wasn't in the kind of emotional pain that I see a lot of people in, who come to these groups. I was pretty confident, and I mean, I was a professor, a college professor at age 26, and I found being a woman an advantage in those days. I mean, we hear so much about, you know, well, I mean, and it's true, how hard it is to get equal treatment as a woman. That has not been my experience. I think I think for me it's been an advantage, perhaps just because when I was born, when I came of age may have been just the right moment for women, and then we regressed
Mm.
as a culture. So we're then getting into like around the 80s, and NTL kind of went into financial problems. We were having to do workshops for NTL, even like a 2-week workshop for no pay to help the organization because we were all so committed to it. But there was some financial mismanagement plus not any nefarious thing, but it was just hard. It became harder in the 80s to sell these kind of programs because they were expensive. They were usually at resort locations and things like that. Uh, so I guess NTL didn't adapt to the changing economy. But anyway, it was not going to be sustainable for people like me to, give up 2 weeks of my time for for no pay. So that went on for a couple of years, and then NTL's still around and is still teaching T groups and a lot of other kinds of groups. And it was called National Training Laboratories, and now it's called NTL Institute. So I just want to kind of give credit to that organization because they were really very instrumental in teaching a lot of us oldsters about all this stuff. And many of us taught college, so then we taught a lot of the people who are now the mothers and fathers of you people. I guess I'd say, because I'm old enough to be the grandmother of almost everyone here, if not the great grandmother. Uh, so I right around 1995 or so, I wrote a book From Chaos to Confidence, Survival Strategies for the New Workplace. And that had a lot of these practices, uh, like welcoming feedback, being transparent, some of the same things that are in the book Getting Real. Because I had done some research and I found that the people in business who coped the best with constant change, because constant change is a big deal in the workplace, having to learn new technologies, being moved around in your workplace and having to quickly build rapport and get to know new people. Uh, that being the big thing is being able to be right in the present with what you're feeling, what you're noticing, what your environment is, so that you can decide what's the right next step. So now we're getting to control, which is, what the whole idea. I be, from studying managers, the people who do well and who don't, uh, I could see that the people who can change on a dime, I called it surfing life rather than trying to control life, who could just show up in the moment and know what to do versus, well, these are our procedures and this is the way a manager behaves and we're always in role rather than being heart to heart with people. I mean, the sort of old control paradigm was clearly not working anymore. Probably hadn't for years. And so, I was trying to put forth this relational paradigm. In fact, in my book, The Couple's Journey, which I wrote in 1980, I put out this big thing. We are entering an age of relationships where the relationships between people are more significant than the thing they're doing. And so so the couple's journey was kind of my first big relationship book. That became an instant bestseller, sold over 100,000 copies, had like 12 printings or something like that. So that's actually my most successful book. Uh, and that was published in 1980. But so move forward, I wrote the book From Chaos to Confidence about change. And that gave rise to um, starting to do more honesty salons in my home. And honesty salons are my version of how to do a here and now, I, thou. That's what we used to call tea groups. I, thou, here, now. That was the shorthand. And I brought that into a kind of a 2 hour format in my home in about 1996. I started teaching these, and they would be small groups, no more than 10 or 12. But now I've found that the ideal number is eight. So I only have eight people in my honesty salon. So it's um, that's good. And you meet the same group over a period of time. But I give them guidelines. See, back in the old days, we didn't know what we were supposed to be doing. All the leaders would say was speak about your feelings, put more emphasis on your feelings and your body sensations and less on your thoughts. And so they made that distinction, between your stories and your actual experience. So that was always an important distinction that we brought forth or forward. Here's your experience. What do you see? What do you feel? Um, and then what does your mind do with that? What's your story? So, that's a big part of what we do in authentic relating now. So the honesty salons had a list of guidelines like check in with yourself before you speak, connect with yourself and others using eye contact, breath, all those things can help, that type of thing. So I had about like 18 guidelines or something that people would read at the beginning of each salon, and then they would just go into an unstructured process. And I would just try to help people stay with their own experience and pause and just, okay, as you say those words, let's say somebody's in a narrative about something that happened yesterday. As you speak about what you saw there, what do you notice in your body? So those are sort of basic interventions that we all still use. Um, and so honesty salons, I'm still doing them. And I think the thing I personally get out of uh, doing all this work is it just opens my heart to humanity. Um, it helps me feel more love and compassion and tenderness. And because I do think being a person that didn't suffer a lot in my life, I need help staying soft. Not that I'm not a loving person. I'm extremely, you know, like I, I don't have much resistance to anybody. I'm pretty open. Um, but I think my secret agenda was to understand the world of emotional pain more deeply, to round myself out. And I pretty much realized this in my first NTL groups. I remember thinking to myself, Susan, how are you gonna write the great American novel if you're uh, so shallow? And that type of thing. I could see that, I was kind of like a cheerleader, and that sort of thing. That was my personality. And that I was critical of that. I thought that's only a very small part of what it means to be human. So let me just pause there and see what you have to say. That was a long, long narrative.
Yeah, thank you. I'm yeah, it's fascinating for me. And I think what really stands out is, and I didn't know this, so I had a hint of it, but I didn't know that there was such a clear academic connection to the early years of practice here. Because the community I know these days is largely sort of, well, self-help business led. So it's like private entrepreneurs who are doing their workshop or their coaching things or their courses, but mm, there's very little collaboration, I find, and there's very little coherence in a field of like what is happening here. So it feels
Hmm.
really, well, I like hearing about it. Also because my background is in academia, although in the field of sort of urban planning, but
Hmm.
participatory design, how to make cities where people thrive more and that kind of stuff. So it's like it awakens that part of me, and also just the sense of, oh, there's a bigger reason for why we're doing this stuff. It's not only about sort of the individual self-development process. It's actually there's a bigger societal lens. And yeah, that's some of what I'm hearing, and I get sort of I feel inspired. And
Yeah. And even the future, just to butt in for a second here, in terms of the societal lens, humans need to evolve themselves. Later on, I co-founded the Institute for the Study of Conscious Evolution, which I should mention in there, but it has nothing to do with authentic relating exactly. But my background motivation is always let's up level ourselves so we can actually deal with a world of constant change where we don't have to like be able to predict what's going to happen before we speak into the space. And so, to me, the most intimate and relevant to human development place to practice stepping into the unknown and trusting yourself to deal with what happens next is a hugely important human capacity for these times with exponential change. I mean, it's happening way faster than when we first used that term. So yes, I'm glad to see that, Peter, that I really always come from this bigger context. Plus, the other big developmental task of our culture is learning to deal with people who see things differently than ourselves. The polarization in the world, the right, wrong, left, right, and so forth, um, type of thinking is not the wisest. We can evolve ourselves to be able to, in getting real, I call it holding differences. And it's a real discipline to be able to fully listen to somebody whose views you kind of violently disagree with, to hold more complexity, basically. And again, the best place to learn that is in an interpersonal, really face-to-face kind of situation. So I see this as that our whole authentic relating movement is a place to learn to be more fully what humans can be and evolve ourselves consciously. So change and conflict are the two biggest challenges of our time, is the way I like to think of it. And these practices really help you um, s step forward and become one of those people, one of the wiser people, rather than just smart.
mm,
Mm.
yeah, I like it. It's like my journey in this has been coming from sort of the city, like how do we create better cities for people to thrive in, and then going from there to like, well, we can't really do that without working with the organizations that
Yes.
that develop and design cities. So it started working a lot with organizational development,
Mhm.
especially in municipalities in Scandinavia. And then I landed in this, well, it's pretty tricky to really do work in these municipalities without working with sort of the groups of people that are there and sort of their interrelating. And then I
Yeah.
got really into sort of the authentic relating stuff and how do we actually communicate with each other? How do we really listen? And then
Yeah.
and then I landed in like, well, and that requires a lot of individual personal development for those people.
Yes.
And well, and then ultimately like, and for me to be able to support this work, it requires me to actually work on myself. So that has sort of been my journey, maybe not as linear as I explained it there. And what I noticed listening to you is sort of the line going back. That is like some of my struggle the last couple of years have been sort of not finding myself being fully comfortable in this field of authentic relating, or whatever we call it these days, that stays sort of mm, as self-development only, but
Mm,
wanting to sort of bring it back somehow.
mm.
And yeah, and I've had a fun doing that when I've been teaching at university, and sort of bringing relating practices into that and doing courses for planners and stuff like that. And it feels very inspiring, just, being with you and sort of hearing about how the roots have actually been much more of that. Um,
Yeah, and to deal well with a group, let's say a corporation, where there's naturally resistance to change, and resistance in our world should not be a judgmental term. I know I've seen a lot of teachers, they say, "Oh, let's stay away from the word resistance." Resistance just means, you know, holding to the familiar, fear, in an individual sense. It's, you know, we all have fears of anything new, that we're not going to be able to do well, fear of failure, fear of being judged, all that kind of stuff. And so making the whole world of fear, more, bringing it into the conversation and embracing those fears. So my main bit of work now, even in my honesty salons, is noticing when you start to feel uh, resistance, fear, judgment, any of those kind of, no, I don't like this, really being curious about that, because that's something vulnerable and tender inside yourself. And I think once we understand how to work with our fears in a sophisticated way, I call it trigger work, where you really examine the body sensations, the stories, like I'm not being listened to, they're discounting my voice, those kind of, I mean, those are fears, even though they sound like judgmental thoughts. And we also call them stories, and I call them fear stories sometimes. Um, they're something that you really have to look at first before before any change can happen. There was a very important social psychologist that I should mention, Kurt Lewin, um, who mapped out how change happens, and he helped us. He helped us, all of us back in the day. I think his work was mostly in the 50s, but he helped us understand that resistance to change is something that really, especially in organizational work, you need to really come to terms with that and look at the sources for that resistance. And sometimes it is just personal fears. So we're we're talking a lot about vulnerability in our authentic relating groups and our circling. I mean, it's like kind of almost like a value to admit your vulnerability. And to me, part of that is owning that you have fears, but also the other side of vulnerability for me that I think people forget is the ability to let something impact you. That's the part of vulnerability that I've worked on all my life. Is I go away from hearing other people's feelings and their stories, feeling moved, impacted. And that's such a value for me, a valuable type of vulnerability. Admitting my fears isn't that hard to me. Um, but if if it's hard, that's probably even going to be more important for you to learn how to do.
mm,
Uh, but I, but to see the trigger work involves, when you notice a fear, softening around that, bringing a witness. Usually I have people, breathe and recognize the space inside yourself that's more compassionate and can hold with compassion or with empathy, that tender part. And when we can do that for ourselves, we can do that for others. And we can even do that for systems. Like you can be so frustrated in a meeting where you're trying to get the organization to buy off on one of your proposals as an urban planner, you know. The more people in the system, the more frustrating it tends to be for the consultant. So we have to really come back to being curious, just like with an individual, curious about the resistance, why these people are are saying, "Oh, that's just another fad." I mean, I hear this all the time when I go into a system. That's just another fad, you know. We did that 10 years ago, or we did something like that, and it, never amounted to anything.
Mm.
Because all these people in organizations are put through so many different trainings
Yeah,
that
and that
didn't
seems true for me.
elect, they
Mm.
didn't elect to be at this training.
But
And
in
I,
my experience working with planners and public servants, generally, my sense is that that is very true, that there are fads, and
yeah,
like when I'm not super well studied in organizational development theory, but when I look at newer books on organizational development, I kind of see the same stuff that Peter Senge and the MIT people talked about in the 70s.
yeah,
And my sense of it is, well, it's hard to do in practice. So what happens in many organizations is that it does become a fad because it's just people coming with new words. Like in my field, it has now moved from participatory design to co-design. And
mhm.
and
Hey,
academically,
language for the same thing.
yeah, no, academically there is a difference, and that kind of makes sense. But in practice, it's like no, it's just hard to actually work with people. It's hard to go out and listen to people and to design something based on that listening and involve people in the thing you're designing when what you're designing is complex. And it requires a lot of the groups and the individuals that do it. And my sense is that we rarely take seriously how impactful that is and how difficult it is and how
Difficult it is.
much practice it requires. And
Yes. And the organizations don't have the budget to pay people like us to really take the time it would need. And I'm saying it would need because it happens so rare to really integrate the change that is is being implemented. So, it's easy to call it a fad because it never really touched you in any way. You just went through the motions, you went through the training. And 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 this is something to maybe look at in our more personal development oriented groups too.
Mhm.
Uh, it it really takes quite a lot of deeper inner work and going through some pain usually, and going to places in yourself that you're ashamed of, parts of yourself you don't like. Uh, you might have to hear some feedback that 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 when I say feedback, I mean sharing impact, because I always use the term experience-based feedback. In other words, when I'm listening to you right now, I notice my heart sinking and I'm saying to myself, "Oh, honey." So you're revealing what's going on inside of you. That's feedback. But it might be hard for people are scared of feedback even to this day, or impact sharing. And that's where we really get stronger, is hearing things that are hard to hear, but not being abandoned, not abandoning yourself and not being abandoned by the others and the other who maybe has spoken that to you, but staying engaged long enough so that you have come to terms with why that pain is why that pain is there and why that comment affected you so much, and that it's probably really a gift to bring you in touch with a part of yourself that you've abandoned. So, I mean, this is the level of work that I think leads to the kind of wiser human that can tolerate emotional pain so that they can take the needed risks to speak up against corrupt politicians or corrupt policies within an organization. We need people to be speaking out and taking personal risks to change these systems because, there's this obedience to authority phenomenon where we're afraid to speak up because the authorities will will say, well, like what used to happen to my father. He was a manager, and he would tell his company, his supervisors, his CEOs, the customers really don't want those old business machines anymore. They want better, faster, cheaper computers. Why aren't we making like desktop computers like IBM? Because it was only IBM in those days. And the management would say, oh, don't be so negative. You're just making excuses. Get out there and sell our products. And that kind of stuff still goes on. I can't believe it. That was the 50s that I'm talking about now. And corporations still shoot the messenger, or, people in authority still shoot the messenger. Uh, I think there was this movie, Don't Look Up. Oh, it was about the dangers. Was it about the dangers of nuclear power or something? I can't even remember what it was right now, but people in very high positions knew that their product was damaging, to the environment and to the world, but they never dared say anything
Mm.
because they might get fired. So we need to strengthen ourselves so that we are uh, able to tolerate and speak about inconvenient truths.
Mm.
So I mean, that's my mission, is building a stronger center with more agency, because like heaven knows now there's so much oppression on the human mind, like we're supposed to buy into AI as the great new thing. Well, what are the data centers doing to the environment, and so forth and so on? Do we do we really know how to have a democracy where differences are aired? I mean, you mentioned how human relationships, when we get into organized groups, the company has a mission and so forth that we're supposed to serve. When we get into organized groups, it's really hard to get anywhere. Well, that's another way of saying democracy is really hard.
Mm.
And democracy across the planet, and especially in the US, we're aware of that, is in crisis. And many more and more, there's a tendency toward authoritarianism in this world. And that's partly because I think, I haven't quite mastered the holding differences, the listening across differences,
Mm.
and the whole ability to cooperate and collaborate is vital. And the authentic relating skills and practices are crucial here in building trust and learning to hear bad news type of thing.
Mm.
But I mean, I think each individual facilitator has their own personality, and there's always a tendency in groups to avoid conflict. In the old days, they used to almost try to, in the encounter groups especially, they used to try to almost stimulate conflict. Uh, it was a little bit of play acting on the part of some of the facilitators. I never did that, but I was in groups where that happened, provoke each other to have a fight or that sort of thing.
Mm.
Uh, we don't want to do that, I don't think, but we need to somehow bring out the true conflicts, or I don't want to say conflicts because differences are the word difference is more what I'm interested in. Bring out the the differences that potentially could create conflict
Mhm.
and more deeply look into how that feels, how scary that is.
Mhm.
When somebody I value, respect, has a difference
Mhm.
from me. Uh, that's one of the biggest challenges that I'm trying to work with in my world.
Mhm. Yeah, for me, it's been, well, what I'm thinking about is like controversy as a word, which I've worked quite a lot with in, yeah, again, in this sort of urban planning kind of world. This, what are the controversies that are present in a planning project or in an organization or in a group of people? And then can we look at this
Yeah,
and like, oh, we seem to be having these controversies or
yeah,
dilemmas, you could also call them, where there are opposite opinions, but we can look at that together and then sort of just recognizing that makes a big difference and sort of widening the understanding of what the controversy is.
yeah. And the good thing about working in like a normal organization in society is you get real differences. In our authentic relating groups, a lot of times it's people all of one flavor of worldview. You know, we're all wanting love, the love trust model, type of thing. Whereas when I go into a school, half the teachers want innovation and half the teachers want to keep with the old ways, because they're almost almost about to retire and they don't want to have to change anything, that type of thing. But you have to somehow we have to really empathize with those senior teachers,
Mm.
rather than making them wrong. And same thing with like the liberal and conservative. How can we understand that a lot of the southern United States, in our case, is still mad about the abolition of slavery? How do we understand that? How do we understand how that how and I've had many conversations with Southerners because I'm a Northerner, but my mother is from the South. So, I mean, that's a huge polarization in this country to this day. Um, but I've had many conversations where the abolition of slavery hurt these people economically, or a teacher who said once integration was forced back in the 50s, and I mean school integration now, where the black kids were bused into the white schools, it was awfully hard to teach, you know, having blacks and whites in there together. Uh, because they weren't trained in how to ameliorate that kind of difference. It was just LBJ, or I think that's who was president then, President Johnson, just said, you guys are going to do it. So, so there's like it's the big lesson is it's really hard to get people to cooperate around something where they have different interests. And they really do, like the proponents of AI, plus the people who are a little more cautious about AI. These two subgroups now really have very different interests.
Mm.
How are we ever going to get together? So I think that the authentic relating movement has made some really good improvements on what I'm going to say what we used to do. It's the terms, some of the language is a lot more crisp, um, like calling it impact, sharing impact. That's a very important linguistic difference rather than the sloppy old term that I used to use, experience-based feedback. I mean, what does that mean, But sharing impact, that's crisp. So I mean, I love some of the intelligence that's um, been evolving. And by the way, sometimes I'm called the grandmother of authentic relating. Well, that's because like Guy Sangstock and Robert McNaughton at the Integral Center and some of those people used my book, Getting Real, as a textbook for their trainings.
Mm.
But I didn't find out about that until about 8 years after the book was published.
Mm.
I didn't even know that that was going on. And so I kind of got into the grandmother role without even knowing it.
Mm.
But I know Robert McNaughton used to share my blogs with his community and stuff like that. But I never met these guys until like 2010, 11, 15, you
Mm.
know, it was already happening. And I was just delighted. I go, whoa, this is just what I envisioned for the Getting Real work to, evolve into.
Mm. Wow. Yeah, we're getting close to time here. Um, such a yeah, it feels so enriching to hear this whole sort of background story, and I'm still fascinated with this phenomena of how, at least how I hear you, there seems to have been a shift from a community oriented around sort of, well, academics, training in these things, and working mostly with business leaders or like organizations
Mhm.
to the scene becoming much more oriented in sort of self-help, personal development, and that's more of what we have now. And it just makes me really curious of the a potential sort of reintegration of these things and how that could look.
A lot, a, a lot of the AR facilitators are trying to break into corporations and are doing so
Mm.
successfully, fairly successful. I just want to say I wish you guys had the economy that was friendly toward this that
Mm.
I did when I was a youngster.
Mhm.
'Cause the economy is terrible now for these kind of personal growth things in corporations.
Mm.
I mean, it happens, but you gotta really stand out. Of
Mm.
course, a lot of us, I mean, there were a lot of best-selling authors. I mean, we were high profile in the culture people,
Mm.
you know, people who wrote articles for Look magazine, which nobody ever
Mm.
heard of, you know, that kind of thing. I mean, a lot of bestsellers. So um, keep writing books, you guys,
Mm.
and giving your speeches and just trying to make as big of an impact as you can because the world really, really needs our voice.
Mm. Cool. Yeah, that's a lovely note to end on. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, and thanks for Peter for the work you do. Trying to bring these two worlds together. I really respect that.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.